May 5, 1945. Reverend Archie Mitchell drove up a one-lane gravel road on Gearhart Mountain near the logging town of Bly, Oregon. He had his pregnant wife Elsie with him, along with 5 children from his Sunday school class. They were there for a picnic. The ponderosa pines were fragrant. A creek ran cold and clear below the knoll. It was a perfect spring afternoon, 3 days before Germany surrendered in Europe. Archie began unloading the car. Elsie and the children wandered down a slope toward the water. A moment later, she called back to him. She had found something strange in the brush, something large made of paper. Mitchell was about to shout a warning. He never got the chance. The explosion tore through the trees and scattered metal through bark and branches. When Mitchell reached his wife and the children, they were dead. They had been killed by a weapon launched from Japan. A weapon that had floated more than 5,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean on the wind. A weapon that almost no American knew existed. It was part of the Fugo, the Japanese balloon bomb campaign, one of the most unusual, ambitious, and largely forgotten weapons programs in the history of modern warfare. It all started with a Japanese scientist, Wasaburo Oishi, in the 1920s. He was a meteorologist working with Japan's Central Meteorological Observatory. Through meticulous analysis of high-altitude weather balloons during that decade, Oishi documented something remarkable: a persistent, powerful river of wind flowing from west to east at extreme altitudes above Japan. The speeds he recorded were staggering. Some of these winds approached 200 miles per hour. Oishi published his findings hoping for a broad international scientific audience. Outside of Japan, those publications drew almost no attention. For over a decade, Oishi's discovery sat largely unused as a strategic concept. That changed on April 18, 1942. On that morning, 16 B-25 medium bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle lifted off the flight deck of the USS Hornet and flew directly to Japan. They bombed Tokyo, Kobe, Yokohama, and 3 other cities. The physical damage was relatively modest, but the psychological impact on Japanese military planners was severe. The raid exposed a vulnerability no Japanese commander wanted to acknowledge. The home islands of Japan were not out of reach. Japan wanted to strike back. They wanted to bring the war to American soil, but the options were desperately limited. The American mainland sat nearly 4,000 miles from the Japanese coast. Carrier-based aircraft couldn't make a round trip at that range. Submarines could approach the coastline, but delivering a meaningful bombardment payload was logistically complicated and strategically marginal. Then someone remembered Oishi's winds. The concept of a balloon bomb was not new to the Japanese military. As early as 1933, researchers at the Imperial Japanese Army's 9th Technical Research Institute had explored the idea of hydrogen-filled balloons carrying explosive payloads. Those early concepts were short-range, theoretical, and largely shelved. After the Doolittle raid, the program was revived in earnest under Major General Suki Kusaba, who had worked on the original 1930s concept. The objective was to find out if a balloon could carry bombs across 6,000 miles of open ocean without crashing into it. In late 1943, meteorologist Hidetoshi Arakawa of the Central Meteorological Observatory was brought in to study Oishi's original data. His analysis was specific and actionable. A balloon released from Japan's Pacific coast during the winter months, maintained at an altitude between 30,000 and 35,000 feet, could reach the North American continent in as few as 30 hours. The strongest jet stream winds blew between November and March. That seasonal window became the operational timeline for the entire campaign. The engineering challenges that followed were formidable. At 30,000 feet, a hydrogen-filled balloon was subject to dramatic temperature swings between day and night. Solar heating during daylight hours would expand the gas inside the envelope, pushing the balloon higher than the ideal altitude band. At night, the gas would cool and contract, causing the balloon to descend. If it sank too low, it would either leave the jet stream entirely or descend into the ocean. Either outcome meant mission failure. The solution was an automated altitude control system. The balloon carried a barometric altimeter, which was a pressure-sensitive sensor, connected to a series of sandbags hanging below the payload assembly in a ring. When the balloon dropped below a preset altitude threshold, the sensor triggered a mechanism that released one sandbag at a time, reducing total weight and allowing the balloon to climb back into the jet stream. The entire process required no human intervention. It was self-correcting, mechanical, and elegant. Each balloon launched with between 30 and 32 sandbags. As it traveled across the Pacific, it shed them one by one, correcting altitude drops through the night. When the last sandbag was gone, a timed fuse mechanism would begin releasing the bomb payload in sequence. The incendiaries first, then the anti-personnel device, and finally a flash bomb intended to destroy what remained of the balloon envelope. On paper, the system was remarkably sophisticated for the time. American engineers who later examined recovered balloons were notably impressed. The balloon itself needed to be lightweight, structurally sound, and capable of retaining hydrogen gas at low temperatures and extreme altitude for 3 to 4 days. Metal was too heavy. Rubber was in short supply. The material the Japanese engineers selected was washi, a traditional handmade paper derived from the bark of the kozo tree, a species of paper mulberry. Washi had been produced in Japan for over 1,000 years. Its long, interlocking fibers gave it structural strength that far exceeded Western machine-made papers of comparable weight. For the Fugo program, sheets of washi were laminated together in 4 to 5 layers and bonded with konnyaku, a starchy, gelatinous paste made from the root of the konjac plant. The finished laminated material was sealed with a vegetable-based lacquer. The result was a gas containment envelope that allowed hydrogen to leak at roughly half the rate that helium seeped through the rubberized fabric used in American military airships. American analysts who tested recovered balloon material were genuinely surprised. What looked like paper, fragile, simple, and low-tech, was a functionally engineered aerospace material that outperformed conventional rubberized alternatives in key metrics. When fully inflated with hydrogen, each balloon measured 33 feet in diameter and required 19,000 cubic feet of gas. Preparing a single balloon for launch took approximately 30 men and between 30 and 60 minutes under good conditions. Launches could only be conducted during specific favorable wind windows, roughly 50 usable days during the November to March season, with a maximum of about 200 balloons per day possible across the 3 launch sites on coastal Honshu. The production scale required to build 9,000 of these was enormous. Washi manufacturers across Japan were mobilized, and their output was redirected to the program. Because the assembly work, laminating and gluing dozens of precisely cut sheets together, required fine motor control and careful handwork, the labor force that actually built the balloon envelopes was composed largely of Japanese schoolgirls. Thousands of teenage girls were conscripted from high schools across the country. They worked in converted theaters, music halls, and at a famous sumo arena in Tokyo, sitting in seiza posture on cushions, scooping konnyaku paste from wooden measuring boxes with their fingers, gluing washi sheets together piece by piece. The school day was restructured, so students had more afternoon hours available for the work. Large indoor venues were commandeered because inflated balloons needed vast enclosed spaces for quality inspection and final preparation. The girls worked without knowing what they were building. They understood it was war material. They were not told it was a weapon. The first operational Fugo balloons were launched on November 3, 1944. The date was the 92nd birthday of the grandfather of the reigning emperor. In November alone, approximately 700 balloons were sent aloft. The rate increased through the winter, 1,200 in December, 2,000 in January 1945, 2,500 in February, 2,500 in March. The final 400 were launched in April before the program was terminated. The standard payload for each Fugo consisted of one 33-pound high-explosive anti-personnel bomb and four 11-pound thermite incendiary devices. The intent was twofold. The incendiaries were designed to start large-scale forest fires across the Pacific Northwest, blazes that would consume firefighting resources, divert military attention, and terrify the American civilian population. The anti-personnel bomb was meant to kill anyone in the blast radius at the moment of detonation. There was a darker dimension to the program that never fully materialized. Japanese military planners had seriously considered loading the balloons with biological agents, specifically anthrax and other pathogens, to be dispersed over North American territory. The plan was ultimately abandoned, not out of any moral calculation, but because the unpredictability of each balloon's flight path and duration made reliable delivery of viable biological material impossible to guarantee. That practical limitation, rather than anything else, is what stopped a potential biological attack on the continental United States. The first confirmed encounter with a Fugo balloon on North American soil occurred on December 6, 1944, near Thermopolis, Wyoming. Witnesses reported a sudden brilliant flash of red fire and what appeared to be a parachute drifting earthward. Army investigators found fragments of a Japanese 15-kilogram anti-personnel bomb the following morning. A similar incident occurred in Montana on December 11th. FBI agents, Army officers, and naval intelligence personnel gathered to examine the debris carefully. The conclusion that paper balloons had drifted 6,000 miles from Japan was initially dismissed as implausible. Military analysts explored other explanations first. German prisoner-of-war camps in the Pacific Northwest were investigated as possible launch sites. Japanese-American internment camps were scrutinized. The most persistent early theory held that the balloons were launched from submarines operating just off the coastline. What forced a reassessment was sheer volume. As January and February of 1945 arrived, the balloons were turning up everywhere. They fell into rivers. They came down on forest roads. They tangled in power lines and interrupted electrical service. Military pilots scrambled to intercept them, but achieved almost nothing. The balloons traveled at altitudes above 30,000 feet, higher than most fighter aircraft of the era could comfortably operate, and their compact profile made radar tracking nearly impossible. In total, American and Canadian pilots managed to shoot down only about 20 of the 9,300 balloons launched by Japan. Sightings were eventually confirmed across a geographic range that stunned military planners. Balloon components were recovered from Alaska to Arizona, from California to Michigan. One was found 10 miles from Detroit. 2 were recovered in Mexico. The campaign stretched from Alaska to Arizona and as far east as Nebraska and Kansas. No foreign weapon had ever penetrated so far into the American interior. On January 4, 1945, the United States Office of Censorship issued a bulletin to every newspaper and radio station in the country. The government directed the press to report nothing about Japanese balloon bombs, no sightings, no recoveries, no descriptions, no speculation about their origin. The rationale was precise. If Japan received no news coverage of the campaign's results, it had no feedback mechanism. No reports meant no way to assess whether the balloons were arriving. No assessment meant no ability to adjust or continue the program with confidence. The American press complied fully and immediately. Newspapers spiked the stories. Radio stations said nothing. Editors who had already drafted pieces killed them. The American public, across dozens of states, remained unaware that a Japanese weapon was drifting through their skies. The censorship operation was one of the most successful voluntary information suppressions in wartime American history. It worked exactly as intended. By spring 1945, the Japanese military had received no reliable reports of balloons reaching the continent. They concluded the program had failed. In April 1945, Japan officially terminated the Fugo campaign. By then, 9,300 balloons had crossed the jet stream. Japan never found out how many had arrived. On March 10, 1945, 4 separate Fugo balloons were detected in the state of Washington. One of them descended into a set of high-voltage electrical transmission lines. The contact caused a short circuit. The largest consumer of power on that grid was a facility called the Hanford Engineer Works, located in a remote stretch of Washington state. Hanford was one of the most classified installations, as it was the Manhattan Project's plutonium production facility, where nuclear reactors running around the clock generated the fissile material for an atomic bomb. When Hanford lost power, its emergency backup systems activated immediately, but it took 3 full days before the plant was fully restored to operational capacity. The plutonium produced at Hanford was later used in Fat Man. The bomb dropped on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. A Japanese paper balloon, built by schoolgirls and glued with vegetable paste on the other side of the world, briefly shut down that operation. The Japanese never found out. The American public would not learn the details for years. Meanwhile, counterintelligence agents near Hanford were dealing with the balloons on the ground. One agent, Vincent "Bud" Whitehead, reportedly chased a low-flying balloon from a small plane and brought it down by throwing a brick at it, puncturing the envelope and deflating it into the terrain below. He then walked all over the recovered material on the ground. A military bus arrived shortly after, carrying personnel in full contamination suits, gloves, and masks operating under standing orders related to the biological warfare concern. Nobody had told Whitehead. He had been wading through material the military was treating as a potential biological hazard in civilian clothes, and no protection whatsoever. American scientists worked throughout the early months of 1945 to trace the balloons to their geographic origin. The breakthrough came from a forensic direction that nobody had initially anticipated: the ballast sandbags recovered from downed balloons. Sand is geologically specific. The ratio of minerals, the microscopic remains of single-celled marine organisms called diatoms, the particle size and composition. All of these characteristics are tied to specific geographic locations. Analysts from the Military Geology Unit of the United States Geological Survey examined the mineral and diatom profiles of sand from multiple recovered balloons. Their conclusion pointed to a beach on the Pacific coast of Honshu, Japan. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed activity in the vicinity. A B-29 bombing raid was conducted against the area. What the Americans could not see from the air was the full scope of the production apparatus that had already reached its operational conclusion. The program was winding down regardless of the strike. The American military also mounted a large-scale defensive response to the fire threat in the Pacific Northwest. The concern was that if an incendiary device from a Fugo landed in dry summer forest conditions, the resulting blaze could consume thousands of acres before firefighters could reach it. The Army's Western Defense Command organized what it called the Firefly Project. 2,700 troops supported by aircraft, positioned to respond rapidly to fire starts across the western states. Among the units deployed under Operation Firefly was the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the United States Army's first all-black parachute infantry battalion. These were trained soldiers who had completed jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia, and spent 1944 in a state of readiness for a combat deployment that the segregated military consistently denied them. When orders finally came in early 1945, the men of the 555th believed they were shipping out to join General Douglas MacArthur's theater in the Pacific. They arrived in Oregon in May 1945 and learned they were there to fight fires. The men of the 555th, known as the Triple Nickels, served with notable distinction. They integrated Army jump techniques with U.S. Forest Service smokejumper methods, parachuting into remote mountainous terrain wearing modified football helmets fitted with wire face masks, armed with axes and hand tools instead of rifles and carbines. The jumps were brutal. Rocky ground, fallen timber, and dense forest made landings dangerous, and broken bones were common. They conducted 1,200 individual jumps while fighting dozens of forest fires across the Pacific Northwest. These were men who had trained for war. The Japanese balloon campaign sent them to fight fires in their own country, on behalf of a military that had refused to fully deploy them as soldiers. But the fires the Triple Nickels were fighting were naturally occurring ones, not those caused by the Japanese balloon bombs. The forests where balloons were landing were snow-covered and saturated with moisture. No significant wildfire was ever attributed to a balloon bomb. The incendiary devices that did reach the ground either failed to ignite, detonated without consequence, or landed in conditions where fire couldn't take hold. The secondary goal, triggering widespread civilian panic, also failed, because the censorship operation ensured the public had no idea the attacks were happening. Japan's propaganda arm attempted to broadcast claims of massive American casualties and forest fires through the WWII news agency in February 1945, announcing 500 dead, or, in some broadcasts, 10,000. The numbers were fiction, and the American press didn't run them. The psychological operation collapsed before it could land. Post-war interviews with Japanese military officials confirmed what many historians had suspected. The Fugo campaign had been undertaken almost exclusively for domestic propaganda value. Japanese civilian morale needed proof that the empire could strike back at America. The actual expectation of strategic military effect was minimal. The weapon was a gesture of defiance built on paper and launched into the wind, aimed at a continent 6,000 miles away. But there were casualties in Bly, Oregon. Archie Mitchell's congregation in that small logging town would not learn the real cause of the deaths on Gerhardt Mountain for weeks after the explosion. Military vehicles arrived at the scene within 45 minutes of the blast. A military intelligence officer went directly to the local telephone office and ordered the 16-year-old operator on duty not to accept or place any civilian calls. That operator was a girl named Barbara Connor, who had narrowly escaped being on the bombed outing herself. Angry residents gathered outside the telephone building, banging on the windows, unable to reach their own families or report what had happened in the forest. The official military statement described the deaths as an explosion of undetermined origin. Local residents who knew the truth followed military directives and kept silent. The victims' families were left without public acknowledgement of what had actually happened, or why. Joan and Dick Patsky, two of the children killed on Gerhardt Mountain, had a brother named Jack who had been shot down the previous year while serving as a bomber crew member. He had been a prisoner of war but escaped. He was shot and killed in April 1945. The family buried 3 of their children that spring. Archie Mitchell survived the explosion on Gerhardt Mountain. He went on to marry Betty Patsky, the older sister of 2 of the children killed that day, in 1947. In 1962, he traveled to Vietnam as a civilian aid worker with a Christian mission. He was taken captive by the Viet Cong that year and never seen again. By the end of May 1945, 3 weeks after the deaths in Oregon, the United States military reversed its position on censorship of the balloon bomb story. Public safety required it. A broad educational campaign was launched warning Americans, particularly children in rural and frontier areas, not to touch or approach any unfamiliar objects they found in forests or open fields. The warning came too late for the 6 people who died on Gerhardt Mountain. Their deaths were a cost of the information blackout and the extent of the casualties caused by the Foucault campaign. Of 9,300 balloons launched, approximately 300 were confirmed recovered or observed in North America. No meaningful objectives completed, but the Foucault sits in a category of its own in the history of warfare. Historian Ross Cohen, who wrote the definitive scholarly account of the campaign, characterized the weapon as the world's first intercontinental weapons system. The intercontinental ballistic missile would not arrive until 1957, when the Soviet Union launched the R-7. The balloons did not stop appearing after the war ended. Recovered components continued turning up across the American West for decades. In 1953, an Army disposal crew detonated a recovered balloon in Edmonton, Alberta. In 1955, the Air Force found one in Alaska. In 1984, researcher Bert Weber had cataloged 45 balloons in Oregon alone, with 37 more in Alaska, 28 in Washington, and 25 in California. In 2014, a structurally intact balloon was discovered in British Columbia, Canada, technically still functional, nearly 70 years after it had been released from a beach in Japan. Military authorities continue to advise anyone who discovers an unidentified object in the remote forests and wilderness areas of Western North America to leave it alone and contact the proper authorities. Some balloons that crossed the Pacific and never detonated are still out there somewhere, buried under decades of forest floor, hidden in ravines, waiting for the moment someone finds them. Subscribe to World War II, Steel and Power for more great stories from this monumental era.